G'day folks, and welcome to a countdown of 10 rock bands who went out on top of their game. This is where I look at a bunch of rock groups who never jumped the shark but split up while still at their peak and left their fans wanting more. But one rule across the board applies. The band in question has to have released at least 3 studio albums during their lifetime. So I'm looking at groups with a substantial recording career before they called it quits. So yes, that means no to these bands. And I'm going to warn you that there's going to be some tangents along the way. In fact, there's going to be one right now. Before I start the top 10, I'm going to begin with 3 honourable mentions. Honourable mention number 1, Simon and Garfunkel. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel are immediately disqualified from the main list simply because they are not a rock band. But other than that, they're the perfect example of what I'm looking for here. After a false start as Everly Brothers style teenage rock and rollers Tom and Jerry, the rebranded Simon and Garfunkel with their college scarves and serious expressions signed to the CBS label and released the debut album Wednesday morning 3 a.m. The LP was something of a disappointment sales-wise, and that caused the songwriter of the duo, Paul Simon, to relocate to London and go solo. But when producer Tom Wilson added drums and jangly electric guitars to the duo's acoustic tune, The Sounds of Silence, and released it as a single without them even knowing, Simon and Garfunkel suddenly had a #1 folk rock hit on their hands. Paul Simon got back to the States toot sweet and reunited with his golden tonsil buddy. From that point on, the pair's career simply blossomed. By the end of the decade though, their relationship had become strained. Garfunkel undertook an acting career and he was actually pretty good at it, but while he was off being Mr. Hollywood, Paul Simon spent months working on what would become their final studio album. By the time it was completed, Bridge Over Troubled Water had taken up some 800 hours of studio time. But it was time well spent. Looking at the track listing, you could be forgiven for thinking that this was a Simon and Garfunkel best of collection. It made #1 in a dozen countries, staying at the top spot in the UK for 35 weeks, not dropping out of the top 100 there until 1975. But the duo realised they couldn't go on working together, so they called it a day while still riding high. Then in 1981, the two reunited for a one-off outdoor concert in New York Central Park in front of over 500,000 people. The resultant live album and film was another mega hit, and they gained themselves a whole new generation of fans. Then in the 2000s they reunited again to play stadiums all over the world, but tensions between the pair soon resurfaced. Still, maybe that's just as well. They never did go for that one tour too many, or even worse, try to make a belated follow-up to Bridge Over Troubled Water. They went out on top, not once, but 3 times. Honourable mention number 2, Talking Heads. In a 12-year recording career spanning from 1977 to 1988 that saw them release 8 studio albums and 2 live albums, it's fair to say that Talking Heads never made a bad record. But their last 2 albums, 1986's semi-soundtrack to the David Byrne film True Stories and 1988's Naked, are universally considered to be the band's weakest releases, not up there with the likes of Remain in Light, Stop Making Sense, Fear of Music, Speaking in Tongues, etc. In fact, Talking Heads didn't officially split up until 1991, when drummer Chris Frantz happened to read in the Los Angeles Times that David Byrne had actually left the group. Thanks for letting us know, Dave. So while Talking Heads didn't necessarily break up at the absolute peak of their powers, they came pretty close. Very few bands make that many consistently strong albums with no duds amongst them, so a chef's kiss to Talking Heads. Mwah! Honourable mention number 3, Led Zeppelin. Now, Led Zeppelin's first 6 studio albums are pretty much flawless. Perhaps no rock band in history has managed to amass as solid a body of work right from the get-go as Zeppelin did from albums Wonder 4, Houses of the Holy and Physical Graffiti. However, their last 2 LPs, while containing the odd great track and being commercially successful for sure, are more patchy affairs. Also, a series of unfortunate, sometimes tragic incidents curtailed their touring schedules towards the end of the 1970s, and a couple of members were dealing with some pretty serious substance abuse. The death of drummer John Bonham in September 1980 signalled an immediate end to Led Zeppelin, and while the band had never bottomed out during their time together, they just couldn't fully sustain their A-game all the way through. This one was another close call. So, am I out of line here, or do you agree that Led Zeppelin didn't quite go out at the absolute top of their own mountain? I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments section down below. Okay, so that set the bar pretty high. Now here they are, 10 rock bands who went out on top of their game, counting down from 10 to 1. And let me say at this point that this list is in no precise logical order, and I'm not comparing the careers of different bands to each other. I'm simply comparing a band's own career to itself, if that makes sense. Okay, here we go. Number 10, Silverchair. Three 15-year-old school kids from Newcastle in Australia burst onto the international scene selling not coals back to Newcastle, as the saying goes, but a bit of Seattle grunge right back to Seattle. But as time went on, it became pretty obvious that this trio was far more than simply Nirvana in pyjamas. While their debut album Frog Stomp was a killer of a record, it was somewhat musically derivative. However, with each subsequent release, the band became more accomplished and original, and Daniel Johns' songwriting became increasingly artistic and complex, culminating in 2002's magnum opus, dare I say masterpiece, Diorama. Silverchair then took a hiatus, with members following other creative pursuits. Bass player Chris Giano even spent time working in a Newcastle record shop simply because he'd always wanted to work in a record store. The band regrouped in 2007 and put out what would become their final album, the tremendous Young Modern. Young Modern was a massive hit in Australia. It won 6 ARIA awards. The double platinum single from it, Straight Lines, was the biggest Australian hit for 2007. Yes, the album didn't do anything near the business internationally that the earlier ones had, but it was a more than worthy sign-off to their career. Silverchair then bowed out of the spotlight by launching an extensive Australian tour with compatriots Powderfinger and left everybody wanting more. And that's the way to do it. Number 9, The Jam. The Jam were beyond big in their native Great Britain. Led by vocalist, guitarist, songwriter Paul Weller, who was only 18 years old when the band were first signed, they started off blending 60s power pop of early Who with the energy and social consciousness of punk, and quickly evolved into something more diverse and mature within a few short albums. By the time of their 5th LP, Sound Effects, interest beyond the old dart was beginning to build, while at home their singles were consistently hitting the pointy end of the charts. The Jam's 6th LP, The Gift, was their first UK #1 album, and the lead-off single, A Town Called Malice, was the one that broke them in Australia and Canada, and even made number 45 on the US dance charts. By this time, the Jam were moving into a more refined, soulful direction, and their final single, Beat Surrender, was very slick and smooth indeed, and it was their 3rd UK #1 hit. So when news suddenly came through that the Jam were breaking up after one final tour, no one was more surprised than Rick Buckler and Bruce Foxton, the 2 members of the band who didn't happen to be Paul Weller. It was an immense shock to everyone. Fans were left totally devastated, though a year later when Weller debuted his new band, The Style Council, it all kind of made sense. The Jam have never reformed, they never will reform, but they sailed out on the absolute crest of a wave. Number 8, Roxy Music. Aficionados of this group will tell you that their old stuff was way better than their newer stuff. Fronted by the uber suave Brian Ferry and featuring mad scientist Brian Eno on their first 2 albums, Roxy Music were post-New Wave years before New Wave had even happened. They had the style, the sophistication and an aesthetic that transcended decades. And some of us back in the day were simply happy that we had older brothers who were fans of the band so that we could admire the album covers. But true, many will cite the group's first 3 LPs as being their arty creative peak and lament their gradual shift into more mainstream territory. But this list is all about bands who went out on top of their game, and the fact is all 8 of Roxy Music's albums made the top 10 in the UK, with their last 2 being #1s. And so, 1982's Avalon, Roxy Music's final LP, despite only ever peaking at number 53 on the Billboard charts, was their only album to sell 1 million copies in the United States. The title track and the ultra-smooth single More Than This still get regular rotation at what are now oldies radio stations. Roxy Music arrived in style, and they departed in style. Number 7, The White Stripes. This 2-piece powerhouse seemed to come out of nowhere. One minute we'd never heard of them, and then suddenly they were all over the place. A guy on guitar, a girl on drums, spinning out some of the fuzziest, gnarliest, riffiest blues rock we'd heard in years. Formed in 1997, the White Stripes steadily built an indie following, but broke through in 2002 when their 3rd album, White Blood Cells, was re-released on the major label V2. The follow-up, Elephant, contained that riff, 7 Nation Army. In fact, Jack White came up with it at Richmond's Corner Hotel during the band's 2002 Australian tour. The song quickly became an unlikely sporting anthem, echoing across football terraces of all codes all around the globe and even being used as a walk-on music for a Dutch darts champion. From obscure indie darlings, the White Stripes were now mainstream monsters. After Seven Nation Army scored them a Grammy Award for Best Rock Song, the duo repeated Elephant's success with Get Behind Me Satan, earning them the Best Alternative Album nod at the 2006 Grammys. The band always had an obsession with the number 3, utilising the 3 colours, red, white and black, on all their artwork and stage gear, the use of 3 elements to their music, a single vocal, drums, plus a third instrument. So it was fitting that Get Behind Me Satan peaked at number 3 on the US, Canadian, UK and Australian album charts. Their 6th album, Icky Thump, fared even better, hitting top spot in the UK and winning yet another Best Alternative Album Grammy. But all was not well within the White Stripes camp. Drummer Meg White was beginning to suffer severe anxiety on tour, so dozens of future live dates were cancelled, and the band went on an indefinite hiatus that ended up being permanent retirement. But the White Stripes had gone out at the absolute peak of their commercial success. Number 6. Cream. Cream were the first true rock and roll supergroup, comprising 3 musicians who'd been doing lots of real serious muso stuff and were now ready to become superstars in their own right. The band's very name bore not a hint of false modesty, and in live shows, Messrs Clapton, Bruce and Baker played like an improvisational jazz outfit, albeit a deafeningly loud one. But they knew how to knock out the occasional catchy pop single as well, and in barely a 3-year existence, Cream released an astonishing amount of product and did a hell of a lot of touring. But one pitfall of the 3-piece band is that when 2 members can't get along with each other, that's more than half of the group and this spells trouble. In Cream's case, it was vocalist, bassist Jack Bruce and drummer Ginger Baker. But the trio ended their brief career in rapturous applause with a triumphant tour of the United States, followed by a couple of dates at London's Royal Albert Hall, the last of which was filmed for posterity. So yes, less than 3 years of existence, but Cream had fulfilled everything they'd set out to achieve. And a reunion tour in 2005 did not dilute the group's legacy at all. 4 more dates at the Royal Albert Hall sold out within an hour and included these guys in the audience: Paul McCartney, Roger Waters, Jimmy Page, Brian May, Ringo Starr, Mick Taylor and Steve Winwood. With punters like that watching you bow out, you know you've done all right for yourself. Now, before we get to the top 5, it's probably a good idea to look at 2 groups who missed out on this list for various reasons. And the first of those is the Stooges. If you look purely at the 3 original studio albums that the Stooges / Iggy and the Stooges made, their phenomenal self-titled debut, the more menacing and muscular Funhouse, and the incomparable chaos of Raw Power, you'd be fooled into thinking that this band went from strength to strength during their career, but nothing could be further from the truth. In February 1974, Iggy and the Stooges' then final concert was recorded and later released as Metallic KO. And if you've never heard it, this is one train wreck of a live performance. Frontman Iggy Pop is constantly baiting and insulting the audience, and the crowd respond by pelting them with everything from jelly beans to eggs to bottles and cans. As writer Lester Bang said, Metallic KO is the only rock album I know where you can actually hear hurled beer bottles breaking against guitar strings. In fact, the front cover of the album says it all. So it's clear that in the early 1970s, the world just wasn't ready for Iggy and or the Stooges. Things would eventually change, of course. In 2010, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and those first 3 albums are essential additions to any serious record collection. The band reformed in the 2000s and released 2 more studio albums, which, for the most part, tend to dilute their legacy. The Velvet Underground. The Velvet Underground were a band who took several years after the fact to be fully appreciated. And in retrospect, their early studio albums were all pure excellence. From the groundbreaking The Velvet Underground and Nico, the uncompromising mainline shot of White Light, White Heat, to the 2 more melodic and song-driven post-John Cale albums, The Velvet Underground and Loaded. There's a Velvet's album for just about every mood. But what a lot of people don't realise is that that is not the VU's entire original output. And I'm not talking about the 2 live albums or even their many unreleased studio recordings. I'm talking about the 1973 album Squeeze. Squeeze contains no original members of the Velvet Underground on it, which most notably means no Lou Reed. The vocals, songwriting and virtually all of the instrumentation was handled by Doug Yule. Yule, who'd been brought into the band in 1968 to replace John Cale, had featured quite prominently on the previous album Loaded. And to be fair, Squeeze is not a bad record at all. It's an extremely pleasant kind of alt-country pop-rock album. But the thing is, you just don't want to hear the words pleasant and Velvet Underground uttered in the same sentence. Anyway, here's the top 5. Number 5, The Smiths. There's probably no group I can think of who completely divides the rock music community as the Smiths do. People tend to either really love them or absolutely loathe them, and that's just how Morrissey and Marr always wanted it to be. They were a band for the outsiders, and much like the Jam of a couple of years earlier, British Smiths fans had a tribal quality about them, very loyal and very possessive. But unlike the Jam, the Smiths were able to gain a substantial overseas following from quite early on. So it was a supreme shock when after 5 short years, 3 albums, well, 4 really, and a fistful of non-album singles, the guitarist Johnny Marr announced that he was leaving the group. And that was it, the Smiths were no more. The Smiths were unique, and unique is a very rare and wonderful thing in the world of rock music. They were a pure guitar, bass and drums group in an era dominated by synthesizers and drum machines, but they were a guitar group unlike any other. Johnny Marr, while only in his very early 20s, had a command over his instrument that is only now being fully appreciated. Morrissey had and has a vocal style and lyrical language that is incomparable to anyone before or since. And then there was the rhythm section of Andy Rourke and Mike Joyce, who provided the bounce and energy to propel the whole thing forward. The Smiths' excellent final LP, Strange Ways Here We Come, became a posthumous release, and it was their best ever charting album globally. But one thing is for sure, in the words of Taylor Swift, they will never, ever, ever get back together. Number 4, the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Despite Hendrix himself being American, the Jimi Hendrix Experience are technically a British group. Animal's bassist Chaz Chandler had more or less discovered Jimi in New York, brought them back to London and assembled a band around him. Drummer Mitch Mitchell and bassist Noel Redding, who'd never actually played bass before. But there was an instant chemistry between the three, and when the Jimi Hendrix Experience hit the London live circuit, it was like nothing the city had ever witnessed. But aside from Hendrix's outrageous live act with the playing guitar with his teeth behind his head, etc., the sheer volume and his incredible ability, he would quickly prove that he was a fine composer, lyricist and a charismatic singer as well. Signing to Track Records, the Jimi Hendrix Experience had 3 UK top 10 singles right off the bat and then released their game-changing debut album, Are You Experienced, in May 1967. Success in the United States quickly followed thanks to their iconic blockbuster performance at the Monterey Pop Festival in June, and from that point on the power trio was simply unstoppable. Their second album, Axis Bold as Love, showed little sign of a sophomore slump, and soon Jimi Hendrix was a bona fide international guitar megastar and one of the highest paid rock performers on the planet. But as I said earlier, when you have a 3-piece band and 2 members can't see eye to eye, it makes things difficult. In the Experience's case, it was Jimi and bassist Noel Redding. Noel wanted more creative input, wasn't fond of Jimmy's increasingly casual and erratic approach to recording, or the constant hangers-on in the studio. But Hendrix's eccentric studio habits led to the Experience's third and final album, the simply masterful Electric Ladyland. The final blow for Noel Redding was when Hendrix told a reporter that he planned to bring his old army buddy Billy Cox into the band on bass. The only problem was he hadn't actually got around to informing his current bass player of this fact. In June 1969, the Jimi Hendrix Experience appeared at the Denver Pop Festival. Now, because of Woodstock a couple of months later, the Denver Festival is all but forgotten today, but it was a 3-day event featuring several top-notch bands, and like Woodstock, the outside demand became so great that organisers eventually threw open the gates to make it a free event. The Jimi Hendrix Experience closed the festival with their last ever performance, and by the end, there were between 50 and 60,000 people in attendance. By contrast, when Hendrix closed Woodstock a couple of months later, the crowd had shrunk from over 400,000 people to something like 30 or 40,000 by the end of his performance. So there you go, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, 3 brilliant albums, a bunch of great singles, and their final concert was in front of a crowd that was even bigger than Woodstock. Well, okay, I know I'm pushing it. Number 3, Nirvana. Nirvana's first album, Bleach, was recorded on an 8-track tape machine, cost $606.17 to produce, and was released on the independent label Sub Pop. That was back in 1989. By the end of 1991, they were the hottest band on earth. Smells Like Teen Spirit seemed to be blasting out of speakers wherever you went. Their album Nevermind had displaced Michael Jackson atop the Billboard charts and was selling in numbers that can barely be imagined today. But for frontman Kurt Cobain, this meteoric rise from indie obscurity to spokesperson for a generation did not sit easily. Health problems, both physical and mental, were taking a toll. His relationship with fellow musician Courtney Love was becoming tabloid fodder, and his relationship with heroin was another talking point. Yet, amid all of this chaos, Nirvana managed to produce an excellent third album, In Utero, which wisely was no attempt at a Nevermind Part 2. And the two singles, Heart-Shaped Box and All Apologies, showcased the group's more textured and melodic side. So in late 1993, when it was announced that Nirvana were going to perform an unplugged session on MTV, back when MTV was actually a music channel, anticipation was high. Aside from Cobain himself, bassist Chris Novoselic and drummer Dave Grohl, several guest musicians were brought in, and the band delivered a set that was in turns unpredictable and utterly spine-chilling. Who would have known that Kurt Cobain with an acoustic guitar in his hand could be an even more intense and compelling performer than when he was letting fly with a wall of guitar distortion and feedback? In fact, the pin drop moments of the performance were the most memorable, particularly the two cover versions, David Bowie's The Man Who Sold the World and the unforgettable rendering of Leadbelly's Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Sadly, less than 6 months later, both Kurt Cobain and Nirvana would be no more. Nirvana Unplugged in New York was released after Cobain's suicide, and it would be the band's third straight #1 album and earned them their only ever Grammy Award. I wonder whatever became of the drummer though. Now before we get to the top two, there are two more bands I need to mention that almost made this list but didn't for various reasons. And the first is Creedence Clearwater Revival. Has any single songwriter in rock history ever strung together such a run of consistently perfect singles than John Fogerty did between 1969 and 71? And I'm not including songwriting partnerships here. Fogerty did all this on his own. And note, the Creedence never had a US #1 hit, but 5 that went to #2. Very unlucky and the most ever by any group. Now consider this. These are the B-sides to those singles. Are you ready? Born on the Bayou, Lodi, Commotion, Fortunate Son, Who'll Stop the Rain, Run Through the Jungle, Long As I Can See the Light, and Hey Tonight. These were the B-sides, people. Imagine being so in the songwriting zone that Run Through the Jungle, Fortunate Son, and Who'll Stop the Rain aren't even considered good enough to be singles. And then there's the albums. Creedence released 5 albums between 1969 and 1970. 5 albums in 2 years, including 2 US #1s, Green River and their masterpiece, Cosmo's Factory. So what went wrong? I mean, the group split up in 1972, so surely they were still on top of their game. Well, you see, the other 3 members of the band had long complained that John Fogerty was a domineering control freak and that they wanted more creative input. That's fair enough, but there's also the phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Things got so bad that John's brother Tom left in 1971 and CCR continued on as the 3-piece. By this time Fogerty had had enough, and for the next album he told bassist Stu Cook and drummer Doug Cosmo Clifford that if they wanted more creative control, then they could come up with 2/3 of the next album. Write, sing and produce them yourselves. The result was Mardi Gras, and it contained one truly excellent song, Someday Never Comes, one cookin' rocker, Sweet Hitchhiker, and a bunch of songs that ranged from vaguely okay to absolutely abysmal, namely those written by bassist Stu Cook. Rolling Stone magazine's John Landau described Mardi Gras as the worst album I have ever heard from a major rock band. Ouch. The Doors. I can already hear the cries. The Doors, what are you talking about? LA Woman was their best album. Well yes, LA Woman is a magnificent record, arguably their best ever, but hear me out. The Doors amassed an astonishing body of work in an incredibly short amount of time. Between 1967 and 71 they released 6 studio albums and a double live set, and in my opinion all of their albums are great. So why do I not consider that the Doors went out on top of their game? Well, after the release of LA Woman and its subsequent success, Jim Morrison went to Paris and inadvertently became a founding member of rock and roll's infamous 27 Club. But the thing is, the remaining 3 members decided that they could go on being the Doors without him. They released 2 albums as a 3-piece, Other Voices and Full Circle. I mean, these records aren't terrible. John Densmore, Robbie Krieger and Ray Manzarek are all superb musicians, but it's not quite the same, is it? Then in 1978, the trio provided backup to Jim Morrison reading his own poetry on An American Prayer. Some saw this as an absolute vulgar cash-in, while many Doors fans actually considered this album to be a worthy addition to the band's original canon. It's all a matter of taste, but yes, had they left it at LA Woman, the Doors would have gone out absolutely on top of their game. Only they didn't. Okay, time now for the top 2. Number 2, The Police. In 1977, many rock performers who'd been kicking around for a while decided to cut their hair, ditch the flared trousers and put on a skinny tie. The punk/new wave movement of this time offered the chance for many artists to hit the musical reset button. And so it was that American prog rock drummer Stuart Copeland persuaded former schoolteacher Gordon Sumner, better known as Sting, to quit his jazz fusion band, move to London and check out the punk scene. Calling themselves the Police and releasing one thoroughly forgettable single, Copeland and Sting teamed up with an absolute music industry veteran in guitarist Andy Summers. Then aged 35, though he looked 10 years younger, Summers had played with mod R&B outfit Zoot Money's Roll Band back in the mid-60s, the avant-garde jazz prog group Soft Machine, an incarnation of Eric Burdon and the Animals, and had even toured for a while with Neil Sedaka. Bleaching their hair peroxide blonde and now flirting with reggae, the Police had a breakout hit in 1978 with a tango about a prostitute called Roxanne, while their second album, Regate de Blanc, contained 2 British #1 hit singles. Sold-out world tours followed, as did increasing success, Grammys, Brit Awards and hit after hit after hit. But what do I keep saying? That's right, when you have a 3-piece band where 2 members can't get along, you've got trouble, my friend. And in the Police's case, it was Stuart Copeland and Sting. So by the time the band came to record their 5th album at Air Studios in Montserrat, things were getting so tense that after at least one physical altercation, it was considered a better idea that they didn't stand so close to each other anymore. But whatever disharmony there was between the band members during the making of this album, it was certainly not evident within the grooves. In fact, Synchronicity became far and away the most successful album of the Police's career. King of Pain, Wrapped Around Your Finger and Synchronicity 2 were all hit singles, but the stalky Every Breath You Take was a mega smash, topping the US Billboard charts for 2 months and winning a Grammy Award for Song of the Year, beating out Michael Jackson's Billie Jean, amongst others. The Police then did one more tour that culminated in an outdoor concert at that most iconic of venues, Shea Stadium. From there, the group went on a hiatus that eventually became permanent. In 1985, Sting released his debut solo album, The Dream of the Blue Turtles, and it was huge, so he was more than happy to stay a solo act. Then in 2007, the trio reconvened for a blockbuster world tour that was obscenely successful. So that's it. It's time for the number 1. Number 1. The Beatles. Well, talk about the biggest anticlimax in the history of YouTube videos. Of course it's the bloody Beatles. Who else could it be? They released this masterpiece called Abbey Road, and then they split up. And then after they split up, it's this album called Let It Be that's supposed to be the one that was so bad they wouldn't put it out during their lifetime, and it comes to film as well, and it wins a Grammy, it wins an Oscar, and we've since seen Peter Jackson's incredible documentary Get Back, which makes us realise they were even more incredible than we even thought they were. Ugh. You know, you can't compare John, Paul, George and Ringo as people or the Beatles as a thing. They just did what they did and it was all brilliant, and now it's all this. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I had an absolute ball putting it together. And what do you think? Did I miss somebody out? Is there some band I completely overlooked? I'm really, really interested to hear your comments down below. Like and subscribe, all that nonsense if you want. If you don't want, I don't mind. Anyway, it's been great. Thanks for watching.